I have often observed that the most extraordinary mysteries begin in the most ordinary of circumstances, and so it was on that crisp October evening when I found myself at Lady Constance Fairfax's autumn soirée in her magnificent Mayfair residence. Poirot had declined the invitation. He was at that moment deeply absorbed in what he termed a most delicate matter of psychological detection, involving a missing will and a parrot with an inconvenient memory. Left to my own devices, I had accepted the invitation with some enthusiasm, for Lady Constance was renowned for both her hospitality and her extraordinary collection of antique mirrors. The house in Grosvenor Square was one of those Georgian gems that seemed to have been designed specifically to showcase wealth without vulgarity. As I mounted the steps that evening, I could not help but notice how the gaslight from the street lamps created dancing shadows on the perfectly maintained facade. The butler, a man of such dignified bearing that he might have stepped from the pages of Debrett's itself, received my hat and coat with the gravity befitting a sacred ritual. "Captain Hastings," he intoned with just the proper degree of recognition, "Lady Constance is receiving in the Mirror Gallery this evening." The Mirror Gallery. I had heard of it naturally, but seeing it for the first time was quite another matter entirely. The room occupied the entire first floor of the house, a magnificent space that had been transformed into what could only be described as a temple to reflection. Dozens of mirrors lined the walls, Venetian-looking glasses with their silvered surfaces darkened by age, ornate French pieces that had surely graced the palaces of Versailles, and English mirrors whose clean lines spoke of Georgian restraint and elegance. But it was the pair of mirrors at opposite ends of the gallery that commanded immediate attention. These twin masterpieces, each standing nearly 8 feet tall and framed in what appeared to be solid silver, faced each other across the length of the room. When one stood between them, the effect was quite extraordinary. One's reflection seemed to stretch away into infinity, creating what Lady Constance had dubbed the shadow between two mirrors. It was both beautiful and slightly unsettling, as if one were looking down a corridor that led not to another room, but to another world entirely. Lady Constance herself was a woman who seemed perfectly suited to such surroundings. At 58, she possessed that particular kind of beauty that comes not from youth, but from the careful cultivation of elegance over decades. Her silver hair was arranged in the latest fashion, her gown was of the finest silk, and her manner combined warmth with just enough reserve to remind one of her position in society. She moved through her guests with the grace of a conductor leading an orchestra, ensuring that conversations flowed smoothly and that no one felt neglected. "Captain Hastings," she said as I approached, her smile genuine and welcoming. "How delightful that you could join us. I do hope Monsieur Poirot is well." "Quite well, thank you, Lady Constance. He sends his regrets and his compliments on your collection. I confess, the reputation of your mirror gallery hardly does justice to its magnificence." Her eyes sparkled with pleasure. "You are too kind. The mirrors have been my passion for nearly 30 years. Each one has its own history, its own secrets. Those two at the ends," she gestured toward the magnificent pair, "are said to have belonged to the Duke of Marlborough himself. They've witnessed more intrigue and scandal than any novel could contain." As she spoke, I became aware of the other guests moving through the gallery like figures in an elaborate dance. There was Sir Reginald Ashworth, a man whose fortune in shipping had bought him a title, but not, apparently, peace of mind. He stood near one of the French mirrors, his reflection showing a face marked by worry lines that seemed deeper than his 60 years warranted. Beside him, in animated conversation, was Dr. Ambrose Thorne, a fashionable physician whose theories on the connection between mental and physical health had made him quite popular among London's elite. Near the far end of the gallery, I noticed a striking woman in deep blue silk engaged in what appeared to be an intense discussion with a younger man whose bearing suggested military service. Lady Constance followed my gaze and provided the necessary introductions. "That is Mrs. Helena Ashworth, Sir Reginald's wife." though considerably younger than her husband. The gentleman with her is Major David Fairfax, my own nephew. Fresh back from India, I'm afraid, and still adjusting to civilian life. There was something in her tone that suggested the adjustment was not proceeding entirely smoothly, but before I could inquire further, our attention was drawn by the arrival of another guest. Miss Evelyn Marsh, Lady Constance's companion and secretary, had appeared at the gallery entrance with a man I did not recognize. A thin, nervous individual whose clothes, while well made, seemed somehow ill-suited to his frame. "Ah," said Lady Constance, "that will be Mr. Pembroke, my art dealer. He's been advising me on a possible acquisition, a mirror that once belonged to Marie Antoinette herself. Quite extraordinary, if authentic." The evening progressed with the sort of civilized conversation and gentle social maneuvering that characterizes such gatherings. I found myself drawn into discussions of art, politics, and the latest theatrical offerings, all the while conscious of the way the mirrors reflected and re-reflected our movements, creating a constant play of light and shadow that was both fascinating and slightly disorienting. It was perhaps 10 o'clock when I first noticed that something was amiss. Lady Constance, who had been the perfect hostess throughout the evening, had grown noticeably pale and seemed to be having difficulty maintaining her usual animated conversation. She excused herself from a group discussing the latest exhibition at the Royal Academy and moved toward the smaller sitting room that adjoined the gallery. "I believe I shall take a moment's rest," she announced to Miss Marsh, who immediately moved to accompany her. "Please see that our guests have everything they require." I watched as she disappeared through the doorway, her reflection in the great mirrors seeming to linger for a moment before fading into the silvered depths. It was then that I noticed something peculiar about those twin mirrors at the ends of the gallery. The infinite reflection they created seemed somehow different. There was a darkness in the corridor of images, a shadow that didn't belong to any of the people in the room. 20 minutes passed, perhaps 30. The conversation continued, but I found myself glancing repeatedly toward the sitting room door. Miss Marsh, too, seemed increasingly concerned, checking her watch and casting worried glances in that direction. Finally, she could contain her anxiety no longer. "I believe I should check on Lady Constance," she murmured to Dr. Thorne, who immediately offered to accompany her. The scream that pierced the air moments later was unlike anything I had ever heard, a sound of pure terror and disbelief that seemed to echo endlessly in the mirrored gallery. Conversations ceased instantly, glasses were set down with trembling hands, and we all moved as one toward the sitting room. What we found there defied immediate comprehension. Lady Constance lay upon her favorite chaise lounge, arranged as if she had simply decided to rest. Her eyes were closed, her hands folded peacefully across her chest, and her expression was one of complete serenity. Yet it was immediately apparent that she was beyond all earthly rest. Dr. Thorne knelt beside her, his professional manner taking precedence over social niceties. After a few moments of examination, he looked up with a grave expression. "I'm afraid Lady Constance is dead," he announced quietly. "The cause is not immediately apparent, but—" He paused, his nostrils flaring slightly. "There is a faint odor, bitter almonds, perhaps. It might suggest—" He did not finish the sentence, but the implication was clear to all of us. Poison. But it was not merely the fact of Lady Constance's death that left us all standing in stunned silence. It was the impossibility of the circumstances surrounding it. The sitting room had only one entrance, and Miss Marsh had been watching it from the gallery. The windows were locked from the inside, their heavy Victorian mechanisms undisturbed. Most perplexing of all, nothing in the room appeared to have been touched. No overturned glasses, no signs of struggle, no indication that anyone other than Lady Constance herself had been in the room. As we stood there, trying to comprehend the incomprehensible, I became aware once again of those twin mirrors in the gallery beyond. Their infinite reflections seemed to mock our confusion, showing us our own bewildered faces repeated endlessly, and somewhere in that corridor of images, that strange shadow that seemed to exist independently of any earthly form. It was then that I knew, with absolute certainty, that this was a case that would require the particular genius of my friend Hercule Poirot. For in the space between those two mirrors, in that shadow that should not have existed, lay the key to a mystery that conventional investigation would never solve. I moved toward the telephone in the corner of the sitting room, my mind already composing the words that would bring Poirot to Grosvenor Square. Behind me, the mirrors continued their eternal dance of reflection, and somewhere in their silvered depths, the truth waited to be discovered. Thus begins the affair at the shadow between two mirrors, with Lady Constance Fairfax dead under impossible circumstances, a room full of suspects each harbouring their own secrets, and a mystery that seems to exist in the very space between reality and reflection. The stage is set for Hercule Poirot's arrival and the methodical unravelling of what promises to be one of his most challenging cases. The telephone call to Poirot was answered with that familiar, precise voice that had guided me through so many extraordinary cases. "Hercule Poirot speaks," came the slightly accented tone, and I felt an immediate surge of relief despite the tragic circumstances surrounding me. "Poirot, it's Hastings. I'm at Lady Constance Fairfax's soirée in Grosvenor Square, and I'm afraid something terrible has happened. Lady Constance is dead, and the circumstances are quite impossible." There was a brief pause, during which I could almost hear the machinery of his remarkable mind beginning to engage. "Ah, mon ami, you will not exaggerate," he said with characteristic precision. "You will tell me only what you have seen with your own eyes, oui. This death, it appears natural. Dr. Thorne suspects poison. He detected the scent of bitter almonds. But Poirot, she was alone in a locked room with Miss Marsh watching the only entrance. No one could have entered or left without being observed." "Impossible, you say?" There was a note of genuine interest now, the tone he adopted when presented with a puzzle worthy of his attention. "But Hastings, you know that Hercule Poirot does not believe in the impossible. There is always the explanation, even when it hides itself most cleverly. I come at once, and mon ami, you will touch nothing, disturb nothing. Make your pretty English insistence felt that no one departs." Securing the compliance of a drawing-room full of highly placed individuals proved surprisingly manageable, perhaps because shock had worn away their natural resistance to instruction, or perhaps because the endless reflections in Lady Constance's mirrors made leaving feel like stepping past one's own conscience. Dr. Thorne positioned himself as sentinel near the sitting-room doorway, maintaining professional propriety while clearly troubled by the medical impossibility he had witnessed. Sir Reginald had sunk heavily into a brocaded chair, his large hands gripping the armrests with white knuckles, his eyes fixed not on his wife but somewhere beyond her, as if searching for answers that refused to materialize. Mrs. Helena Ashworth stood apart from her husband, composed yet taut as a violin string, her striking features betraying an inner calculation that seemed oddly at variance with her outward distress. Her gaze kept returning to the great mirrors at the gallery's ends with a curious fascination, as if seeking something in their silvered depths. Major Fairfax paced with contained military precision, his usual composure cracked to reveal bewilderment and what might have been suppressed anger. Miss Marsh hovered like a sparrow beside the empty hearth, her earlier efficiency shattered, occasionally dabbing at red-rimmed eyes while her lips moved soundlessly through what appeared to be some private litany of regret. Mr. Pembroke, the nervous art dealer, had positioned himself between two gilt-framed Venetian pieces, his quick eyes flitting about the room as if taking inventory of everything except the presence of death itself. His hands worried constantly at his cufflinks, and there was something in his manner that suggested a man wrestling with knowledge he dared not voice. Inspector Japp's arrival brought the reassurance of official authority, his solid presence filling the doorway with professional competence. I had worked with him before on several of Poirot's cases and knew him to be methodical, skeptical, and possessed of that particular wariness that comes from years of dealing with London's criminal element. "Right then, Captain Hastings," he said after I had provided the essential details. "Let's have a look at this locked room mystery, shall we? Though I'll warn you now, murder by remote control is the stuff of penny dreadfuls, not proper police work." His examination was thorough and increasingly frustrated. He tested the window latches, all secured from within, their heavy Victorian mechanisms undisturbed by any tampering. The door frame showed no signs of forced entry, and the room itself presented no evidence of struggle or disturbance. Lady Constance lay upon her favorite chaise as if she had simply decided to rest, her hands folded peacefully, her expression serene. "The medical aspects concern me greatly," Dr. Thorne reported when Japp questioned him. "The faint almond scent I detected suggests cyanide poisoning, but there's no vessel, no cup, no means of delivery visible anywhere in the room. The small table beside her contains only a book of poetry and a porcelain figurine. Nothing that could have contained poison." "And you're certain about the room being observed?" Japp pressed Miss Marsh, who nodded emphatically despite her distress. "I swear it, Inspector. I was in the gallery the entire time, watching that door. Lady Constance entered alone, and no one followed her." "No one could have." As the official investigation proceeded with methodical futility, I found myself studying the assembled suspects with growing fascination. The shock of discovery had stripped away their social masks, revealing the psychological landscape beneath. Sir Reginald's attempts to comfort his wife seemed perfunctory at best, his attention constantly straying to Major Fairfax, with an expression that mingled suspicion and something darker. The Major himself had moved to stand before one of the smaller mirrors, staring at his own reflection with an intensity that suggested profound internal struggle, his hand repeatedly running through his dark hair in a gesture of barely contained frustration. Mrs. Ashworth, though still visibly shaken, was recovering with remarkable speed. She accepted a glass of water from a footman and began dabbing at her eyes with calculated precision, her gaze sweeping the room in what appeared to be a subtle assessment of this new landscape of power and inheritance. There was something in her manner that suggested a mind already calculating the implications of Lady Constance's death. Mr. Pembroke had retreated further into the shadows, almost blending with the dark panelling, his discomfort palpable. He kept glancing at the magnificent mirrors, then quickly away, as if they held secrets he feared to acknowledge. His proposed acquisition of the Marie Antoinette mirror suddenly seemed less like legitimate business and more like a pretext for some deeper involvement. Even Dr. Thorne, for all his professional demeanor, appeared genuinely unnerved by the medical impossibility he had encountered. He kept returning to examine Lady Constance from different angles, as if hoping the scene would yield its secrets through sheer persistence. It was precisely at this moment of official bafflement that we heard the distinctive sound of a taxi pulling up outside, followed by those familiar, precise footsteps on the front stairs. The butler's announcement, "Monsieur Hercule Poirot," seemed to shift the very atmosphere of the room. Poirot's entrance was both ordinary and momentous. His moustaches were immaculate, his patent leather shoes gleaming, his movements characterized by that particular fastidiousness that marked all his actions. He bowed to the assembled company with courteous gravity that acknowledged both their social position and the tragedy that had befallen them. "Mesdames, Messieurs," he said softly, "you will permit that I intrude at a moment so triste." The effect was immediate and remarkable. The weight of responsibility seemed to shift from all our shoulders to his, and even Inspector Japp, despite his natural skepticism about consulting detectives, appeared relieved to have expert assistance. Poirot glanced once at Lady Constance's still form, then moved into the sitting room with that careful, measuring gait I knew so well. He paused on the threshold, taking in everything with his attentive gaze. The untouched glass of cordial on the small table, the book lying face down, a shawl that had fallen in too deliberate a manner to suggest accident, the obstinate window latches, even the faint curl of smoke still rising from a recently extinguished candle. An odor, yes, he murmured, breathing the air carefully. But the nose, it is a traitor. It remembers what it has been told to expect. Dr. Thorne stiffened slightly at this observation. I merely reported what I detected, Monsieur Poirot. In my medical experience— In your experience, Poirot said pleasantly, you have found that the almond scent speaks strongly to the imagination. We will not quarrel with the imagination, Doctor. It is, after all, the humble servant of the little grey cells. But we will not let it lead us astray. He moved to the windows, studying not the latches themselves, but the angles and joins, the way light fell across the sills. Then he straightened and looked through the doorway into the mirror gallery, his eyes resting for a long moment on the twin silver-framed giants that dominated the space. With deliberate precision, he stepped forward and positioned himself exactly between the two great mirrors. His reflection stretched away to infinity, a diminishing army of meticulous figures with carefully waxed mustaches. He shifted his shoulders slightly, and the alignment changed. The corridor of images wavered, and that strange shadow I had noticed earlier seemed to deepen and then dissipate. Curious, he said softly, so that only I could hear. An infinity that prefers a certain stance. Turning to address the assembled guests, he continued more audibly. Now, for the order of things. No one has departed since Lady Constance was discovered? Bon. I ask only the kindness of your voices, each in turn, to tell me where you were positioned when Lady Constance retired from the gallery. It was not a formal interrogation, but rather like the tuning of an orchestra, each voice contributing its note to a larger harmony that only Poirot could hear. The responses came with varying degrees of composure. Sir Reginald's thick admission that he had been discussing Dr. Thorne's proposed sanatorium funding, Mrs. Ashworth's steady claim that she had been conversing with Major Fairfax about his recent return from India, the Major's confirmation that they had been standing near the far mirrors, Miss Marsh's defensive explanation that Lady Constance preferred not to be fussed over when feeling faint, and Mr. Pembroke's nervous assertion that he had been admiring the Venetian mirrors while awaiting news of a cable he had received earlier. Poirot listened to each response with that particular attention he paid not to the content of statements, but to their music. The hesitations, the emphasis, the subtle variations in tone that revealed more than words themselves. Returning to the sitting room, he approached Lady Constance's still form and examined her hands with minute care, though he did not touch her. "Ah," he breathed just once in a tone of recognition. "What do you see?" I asked. "The absence," he replied cryptically. "It always speaks." Then, remembering his audience, he added more audibly, "Lady Constance was a woman of habit, n'est-ce pas?" "Meticulous in all things," Miss Marsh replied eagerly. She kept a detailed day-book, never missed her evening tisane when her nerves troubled her, lemon balm and verbena, which I prepared myself. But tonight she said the air in the gallery would be remedy enough. Yet there is a prepared cordial. Poirot gestured delicately toward the untouched glass. "Crème de noyau," Sir Reginald offered unexpectedly, his voice hollow. "A liqueur Lady Constance favoured. She would take only a thimbleful for gaiety, she used to say, and would barely wet her lips with it." Poirot's eyes sharpened with interest, and she did not wet them tonight. After examining Lady Constance's day-book, opening it with reverent care, reading only 2 pages, and closing it again with an expression of satisfaction, Poirot addressed the gathering once more. "Now we wait for the police procedures, which have their excellence of their kind. Meanwhile, I beg that each of you remains in the gallery. You will not discuss what you have witnessed. Instead, you will think of Lady Constance. Remember the last words she spoke to you, the final look she gave. "Try not to embroider these memories. We must have order." He gave me a look that combined warning with affection. "Hastings, you will be the guardian of our little theatre." As I shepherded the guests back into the gallery, I observed Poirot linger once more between the great mirrors. He held himself perfectly still, then took a single, precise step to the right. The infinite corridor of reflections thinned, and that mysterious shadow retreated into the silvered depths. "Voila," he said to no one in particular, a slight smile playing about his lips. "It is not the mirror that lies. It is the man who stands before it." With that enigmatic observation, he adjusted the curtains of the sitting room to create a precise penumbra, a shadow neither full nor absent, between the two mirrors that watched over us all, like unblinking, all-seeing eyes. The stage was now set for the methodical unraveling of what promised to be one of his most challenging cases, where truth and reflection would dance together until only one remained standing. The morning light, streaming through the tall windows of the mirror gallery, cast new shadows across the scene of the previous night's tragedy, and with it came the methodical efficiency of Scotland Yard's investigation. Inspector Japp had arrived early with his team, transforming Lady Constance's elegant sitting room into a scene of scientific scrutiny. Photographers captured every angle, fingerprint powder dusted surfaces with ghostly precision, and the preliminary coroner's examination confirmed what Dr. Thorne had suspected: death by cyanide poisoning, administered in a massive dose that would have caused death within minutes. Poirot had spent the early hours in what he termed communion with the scene, moving through both rooms with that peculiar combination of reverence and scientific precision that characterized his approach to serious crime. I watched him position himself repeatedly between the great mirrors, studying not only his own infinite reflections, but the way light and shadow played across the silvered surfaces as the morning progressed. He would make minute adjustments to his stance, sometimes no more than an inch in any direction, his eyes fixed on some detail that remained invisible to my less practiced observation. "The mirrors, they are honest," he murmured to me as we stood in the gallery, "but they show only what is placed before them. The question becomes, what was placed before them that we have not yet seen?" It was Miss Marsh who provided our first substantial breakthrough. The devoted companion had remained at the house, her loyalty to Lady Constance extending beyond death itself. Over tea in the morning room, she spoke with the careful precision of someone who had spent years observing without commenting, and her revelations proved illuminating indeed. Lady Constance had been deeply troubled these past weeks, she admitted, her hands wrapped around her teacup as if seeking warmth. She received a letter that distressed her greatly, something about the authenticity of one of her mirrors. Mr. Pembroke had been most insistent about examining her collection, claiming that several pieces might not be what they appeared to be. Poirot's eyebrows rose with keen interest. "And this letter, you have seen it?" She burned it immediately after reading, but not before I observed her expression. She was not merely disappointed, Monsieur Poirot. She was genuinely frightened. Lady Constance was not a woman easily frightened. This revelation cast Mr. Pembroke's nervous behavior in an entirely new light, but before Poirot could pursue this line of inquiry further, we were interrupted by the arrival of Major Fairfax. Lady Constance's nephew appeared haggard, as if he had spent the night wrestling with demons that refused to grant him peace. "Monsieur Poirot," he said without preamble, "there are things you should know. Things that might seem damaging to certain parties, but which must be said if justice is to be served." When Poirot gestured him to a chair, the Major's military composure cracked slightly. My aunt was considering substantial changes to her will. She had grown concerned about certain relationships within her circle, particularly regarding Mrs. Helena Ashworth. There were whispers about her past that had reached my aunt's ears. "What manner of whispers?" Poirot inquired with gentle precision. "That Helena's first marriage, before Sir Reginald, had ended under suspicious circumstances, Her first husband died suddenly, leaving her a considerable inheritance. The death was ruled natural, but there were those who questioned the timing. My aunt had begun to question it as well. Miss Marsh set down her teacup with trembling hands. There were telephone calls from a private investigator in Brighton. Lady Constance would take them in her study, always closing the door. Afterward, she would be quite agitated. The last call came 3 days ago. The picture was becoming clearer, but Poirot's next discovery provided the missing piece of the puzzle. In Lady Constance's private study, among the fragments of burned correspondence in the wastebasket, he reconstructed enough text to reveal its devastating import. Investigation confirms your suspicions regarding the Marlborough mirrors. Not 18th century as claimed. Modern reproductions of considerable skill, but no historical value. Mon Dieu, Miss Marsh gasped as the implications became clear. Those mirrors were the crown jewels of her collection. She paid an enormous sum for them, and Mr. Pembroke assured her of their provenance. If they were forgeries, then Monsieur Pembroke had defrauded her of a considerable amount. Poirot finished, and Lady Constance, being the woman she was, would not have suffered such deception quietly. The afternoon brought Dr. Thorne to the house, ostensibly to offer condolences, but clearly hoping to discuss the medical aspects of the case. His professional manner could not entirely conceal a deep uneasiness about the circumstances of Lady Constance's death. The preliminary toxicology results are conclusive, he reported. Cyanide poisoning, certainly, but the concentration suggests a massive dose administered very quickly. Death would have occurred within minutes, perhaps seconds. Yet there remains no evidence of how the poison was delivered. Poirot studied the doctor with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see past surface appearances. You have known this household for some time, n'est-ce pas? Several years. I've been treating Lady Constance for mild anxiety. Nothing serious, merely the nervousness that sometimes affects ladies of her position. Dr. Thorne hesitated, his professional discretion warring with the demands of investigation. She had scheduled an appointment with me for this morning. She wanted to discuss what she called a matter of urgent importance. She seemed genuinely frightened when she made the appointment. As the doctor departed, Poirot turned to me with an expression of deep satisfaction. Ah, Hastings, observe how the elements arrange themselves. We have a woman who discovers she has been defrauded, who suspects her social circle harbors a potential murderer, and who dies under impossible circumstances just before she can share her fears. Most convenient, n'est-ce pas? But the locked room, Poirot. How could anyone have poisoned her when no one could enter or leave the sitting room unobserved? His smile was enigmatic as he moved once again to position himself between the great mirrors. In the afternoon light, his infinite reflections seemed to shift and waver in the silvered depths, and for just a moment that mysterious shadow appeared again, a darkness that belonged to no one in the room. The room, mon ami, was not locked. It was watched, and sometimes what we watch most carefully is precisely what prevents us from seeing the truth. He adjusted his stance minutely, and the shadow deepened. Consider this. Lady Constance was a woman of precise habits, yet last evening she deviated from her routine in several small ways. The untouched cordial, the fallen shawl, and most significantly. He paused, his eyes twinkling with that particular satisfaction that indicated a crucial deduction. Most significantly, Hastings, the absence that Miss Marsh mentioned. Lady Constance never removed her rings. A lady's hand without her rings is as undressed as a table without a cloth, she would say. Yet when she was found, her hands bore no jewelry at all. Where, one wonders, are those rings? And why would a dying woman remove them? The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implication. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the mirror gallery, Poirot announced his intention to gather all the suspects for what he termed a little reconstruction. "Tomorrow evening," he declared with quiet confidence, "we will have our gathering. All the players in this drama will return to the stage where it began. The mirrors have been patient witnesses, but now they will help us reveal what they have seen. For in the space between reflection and reality, mes amis, lies the truth that will solve this most perplexing case. The stage was set for the final act, where Poirot would use his understanding of human nature, combined with the physical evidence of the impossible crime, to expose a murderer who had thought themselves beyond the reach of justice. The shadow between two mirrors would soon reveal its secrets, and with them, the identity of Lady Constance Fairfax's killer. The morning brought what Poirot termed the little conversations, those deceptively gentle interviews that had unraveled so many seemingly impenetrable mysteries. He preferred a quiet room with 2 chairs placed at a careful angle, so that the words may flow without collision, Hastings, and he received each person alone while Inspector Japp prowled the corridors with increasing impatience. Mr. Pembroke arrived first, his nervousness sharpened to a brittle edge that threatened to shatter at the slightest pressure. He perched on the very front of his chair, hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles had gone white, and began speaking before Poirot had asked a single question. "You must understand," he said with desperate earnestness. "I had no intention of causing Lady Constance distress. I came last evening to advise caution, nothing more. The cable from Paris—" He produced a folded paper with trembling fingers. "From a conservator at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs. He confirms that the profiles on the cresting of the Marlborough mirrors could not predate 1820. Later workshop. Clever, yes, but not what she was promised." Poirot accepted the cable with delicate precision, studying it not merely for its content, but for the way Pembroke's fingers had worried its edges. "You had previously vouched for their authenticity," he observed with that particular mildness that could be more devastating than accusation. "On authority, I believed impeccable," Pembroke replied miserably. "It seems I was deceived as well by a restorer whose credentials appeared flawless, but I swear to you, Monsieur Poirot, I intended to make it right. Lady Constance had paid £30,000 for those mirrors. The revelation would have ruined not only her collection, but my reputation entirely." When Pembroke had departed, leaving behind the lingering scent of fear and guilty knowledge, Sir Reginald Ashworth filled the doorway with his imposing presence. Yet beneath his dignity, I detected the threadbare nerviness of a man whose world was crumbling around him. "I have nothing to hide," he announced before settling heavily into the chair. "Constance was a friend and benefactor to many worthy causes. If you're suggesting that my wife had anything to do with this tragedy—" "We suggest nothing," Poirot interrupted gently. "We merely seek to understand. You were discussing Dr. Thorne's sanatorium proposal when Lady Constance retired." "Indeed. She had pledged £10,000 to the venture, and I had committed additional funds from my own enterprises." Sir Reginald's voice carried the hollow ring of a man trying to convince himself as much as his listeners. The project would have helped many unfortunate souls suffering from nervous disorders. It was then that Inspector Japp's investigation revealed a most disturbing discovery. Among Lady Constance's private papers, secured in a hidden compartment of her writing desk, were documents that painted a far more complex picture of recent events. Letters from authentication experts, correspondence with a private investigator in Brighton, and most damning of all, receipts showing that she had been conducting her own investigation into the provenance of her collection for several weeks. She suspected the deception, Japp reported grimly. Not only about the mirrors, but about several other pieces acquired through Pembroke's recommendations. The financial implications were staggering. She had been systematically defrauded of nearly £50,000 over the past 3 years. But it was Major Fairfax's interview that provided the most chilling insight into the psychological landscape of the case. Lady Constance's nephew entered with military bearing, yet his eyes held a hardness that spoke of profound disillusionment. "I won't dissemble," he said, standing rather than sitting as if his body had forgotten how to be at ease. "Aunt Constance had begun to doubt me, my prospects, my character, my fitness for the position she had once considered offering me. India leaves its marks, and not all of them are visible. Poirot studied him with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see past surface appearances. You have expertise in restoration work, I understand. Traditional craftsmanship techniques, yes. During my leave time, I studied with master artisans. Aunt Constance was initially proud of my knowledge. His voice carried a bitter edge, until she began to suspect how I might have applied it. And your financial situation? Major Fairfax's composure cracked slightly. A modest pension and uncertain prospects. My aunt lived in luxury, while I had risked my life in service to the Empire. She could afford to lose £30,000 and barely notice it, while I faced a future of genteel poverty. When Pembroke approached me about consulting on certain projects, it seemed a reasonable way to supplement my income. The revelation that Major Fairfax had been involved in the forgery scheme cast the entire case in a new and troubling light. Here was a man with both the technical expertise to create convincing reproductions and the intimate knowledge of his aunt's collection necessary to target the most valuable pieces. Yet it was Dr. Thorne's unexpected visit that afternoon that provided perhaps the most shocking development of all. The fashionable physician arrived unannounced, his usual composure replaced by obvious agitation. "Monsieur Poirot," he began without preamble, "there are medical aspects to this case that I can no longer keep silent about. Lady Constance had been consulting me about symptoms that suggested she feared she was being slowly poisoned. Recurring episodes of nausea, dizziness, and a metallic taste that occurred only after certain social gatherings." Poirot's eyes sharpened with intense interest. "And you believe these fears to be justified?" "I arranged for discreet testing. The preliminary results showed traces of arsenic in her system, not yet at lethal levels, but consistent with gradual exposure over several weeks." Dr. Thorne's professional manner could not entirely conceal his distress. Someone had been attempting to poison her slowly, perhaps to make her death appear natural when it finally occurred. This revelation transformed our understanding entirely. Lady Constance had not been the victim of a sudden crime of desperation, but rather the target of a calculated campaign that had been proceeding methodically for weeks. The locked-room mystery of her final moments was merely the culmination of a much more complex and premeditated murder. As the day progressed, Poirot moved through the house with that peculiar combination of reverence and scientific precision that characterized his approach to serious crime. I watched him position himself repeatedly between the great mirrors, studying not only his infinite reflections, but the way light and shadow played across their silvered surfaces. "The mirrors, they are honest," he murmured to me as we stood in the gallery. "But they show only what is placed before them. The question becomes, what was placed before them that we have not yet seen?" It was Miss Marsh who provided our next crucial insight. The devoted companion had remained at the house, her loyalty extending beyond death itself, and her observations proved illuminating. "There is something I did not tell the inspector," she admitted quietly. "Yesterday afternoon, Lady Constance found a smudge on the lower molding of the east mirror. Grease or wax, perhaps. She was distressed, absurdly so for such a small thing. She said someone had put their hand where it did not belong." Poirot's eyebrows rose with keen interest. "And this mirror, it is one of the Marlborough pair?" "Yes, the one facing west. She had me clean it immediately, but she remained troubled by the incident. She kept returning to examine it throughout the afternoon." As evening approached, Poirot announced his intention to stage a complete reconstruction of the previous night's events. "Tomorrow evening," he declared with quiet confidence, "all the players will return to their positions. The mirrors will once again reflect our little drama, and in that reflection we will discover what has hidden itself so cleverly between appearance and reality." Standing once more between the twin mirrors, watching his reflection stretch away into infinity, Poirot made a final observation that would prove crucial to solving the case. "Consider, Hastings, the nature of these mirrors. They present an image, a reflection of what stands before them. But what if the reality itself has been carefully arranged? What if we have been seeing exactly what someone wished us to see, rather than what actually occurred? He adjusted his position minutely, and that mysterious shadow I had noticed before seemed to deepen in the silvered corridor of reflections. The locked room was not locked, mon ami. It was watched, and sometimes what we watch most carefully is precisely what prevents us from seeing the truth. For in the space between two mirrors, between reflection and reality, lies the key to this most perplexing mystery. The trap was being set, and somewhere among our suspects, a murderer was beginning to realize that Hercule Poirot's reputation for solving impossible crimes was about to be demonstrated once again. The shadow between two mirrors was preparing to reveal its darkest secret. The morning brought what appeared to be a breakthrough in the case, though Poirot's expression suggested he found the development more troubling than satisfying. Inspector Japp arrived with barely contained excitement, bearing a small paper-wrapped parcel that he placed on the morning-room table with the gravity of a man presenting evidence that would hang a murderer. "Found this among Mr. Pembroke's effects when we searched his rooms," Japp announced, unwrapping the parcel with deliberate ceremony. A vial of potassium cyanide, clearly labeled and fresh from the chemist's shop. Mr. Pembroke, who had been summoned to witness this revelation, made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. His already pale complexion turned ashen as he gripped the back of a chair for support. "I can explain that," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's a necessary tool in certain restoration practices, cleaning solutions for gilt work, some aspects of electroplating. You must understand, I came directly from my workshop." "Oh, you're a regular chemist, then," Japp interrupted with heavy sarcasm. "And you just happened to bring enough poison to kill a dozen people to a social evening." Pembroke's hands trembled as he tried to explain. "I had been examining a bronze piece with severe oxidation. Cyanide compounds are used in minute quantities for certain cleaning processes. I never intended, I would never." But Japp was already reaching for his handcuffs. "Frederick Pembroke, I'm arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Lady Constance Fairfax. You have the right to remain silent, though I doubt that will help you much now." As Pembroke was led away, his protests echoing down the corridor, I turned to Poirot, expecting to see satisfaction at the case's apparent resolution. Instead, I found him studying the empty vial with that peculiar expression he wore when something struck him as fundamentally wrong. "You seem troubled, Poirot," I observed quietly. "I'm troubled, mon ami, by solutions that present themselves too conveniently," he replied, his fingers tracing the edge of the vial without touching it. "Observe the label. The paper is crisp, the ink still fresh. A man who works regularly with such substances keeps them in familiar containers, old bottles with worn labels, not in pristine vials tied with new string." His point was well taken. The vial looked as if it had been purchased that very morning, not carried from a working chemist's laboratory. Moreover, Pembroke's terror seemed genuine. The fear of a man caught in circumstances beyond his understanding rather than the calculated desperation of, a cornered murderer. Miss Marsh appeared in the doorway, her face etched with concern. "Monsieur Poirot, Inspector Japp has requested that all household staff remain available for questioning. He has also removed Lady Constance's jewelry casket for safekeeping, but—" She paused, wringing her hands. "The rings she wore daily are still missing. I searched everywhere." This detail seemed to energize Poirot considerably. "You are absolutely certain, mademoiselle, that Lady Constance never removed these rings?" "Never," Miss Marsh replied emphatically. "Even when bathing, she would place them on a special porcelain dish beside the basin and replace them immediately after. She used to say that a lady's hands without her rings were as incomplete as a sentence without punctuation." The technical mystery deepens. Later that afternoon, while Japp conducted formal interviews with the remaining suspects, Poirot returned to his methodical examination of the crime scene. I watched him move through the mirror gallery with that peculiar combination of reverence and scientific precision that characterized his approach to impossible crimes. He spent considerable time kneeling beside the sitting-room threshold, examining what appeared to be a dark smear on the white-painted skirting board. "Wax," he murmured, touching the substance delicately with his fingertip. "But not from a candle, Hastings. This has been applied deliberately, smoothed to reduce friction." "Friction from what?" I asked, though I suspected his answer would be characteristically cryptic. "From something that must pass across this surface without leaving a mark. Something fine enough to escape casual observation, yet strong enough to bear a significant weight." He stood, brushing his hands with meticulous care. "Tell me, mon ami, if you wish to move an object from the gallery into the sitting room without entering the room yourself, how would you accomplish such a feat?" I studied the doorway, trying to imagine the mechanics of such an operation. Some sort of cord or string, perhaps, but how could it be concealed from Miss Marsh's observation? Poirot's smile was enigmatic as he positioned himself once again between the great mirrors. "Consider the nature of shadows, Hastings. They exist in spaces we do not think to examine closely, and if a shadow can hide a cord, and a cord can carry a weight." He adjusted his stance minutely, and that mysterious darkness I had noticed before appeared in the infinite corridor of reflections, a thin, unwavering line that seemed to exist independently of any physical object in the room. "The shadow that belongs to no man," he said softly. "From any other position, the eye misses it entirely. But arranged precisely so, voila, the darkness that reveals rather than conceals." Psychological pressure mounts. The afternoon's formal interviews revealed the growing strain on all the suspects. Mrs. Helena Ashworth maintained her composure admirably, but I detected a new brittleness in her manner, as if her carefully constructed facade was beginning to develop hairline cracks under the pressure. "I find these repeated interrogations rather trying," she complained to Japp with aristocratic disdain. "Surely the arrest of Mr. Pembroke resolves the matter. The man had both motive and means." "Perhaps, madam," Japp replied diplomatically. "But Monsieur Poirot has raised certain questions about the evidence that require clarification." Sir Reginald's interview proved even more revealing. The shipping magnate's usual commanding presence had deteriorated markedly, and his responses carried the hollow ring of a man whose world was collapsing around him. "The financial implications will destroy everything I've built," he admitted with painful honesty. "If Helena's past comes under scrutiny, if the insurance companies question their obligations, if my investors lose confidence—" He trailed off, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. Major Fairfax presented perhaps the most complex psychological profile. His military bearing remained intact, but there was something in his eyes, a combination of guilt, anger, and desperate calculation that suggested a man fighting battles on multiple fronts. My aunt had begun to suspect my involvement in certain irregularities regarding her collection, he admitted when pressed. My expertise in restoration techniques, combined with my financial difficulties, made me a natural suspect when questions arose about authenticity. Dr. Thorne's interview provided crucial medical context. "The arsenic poisoning was definitely chronic," he reported. "Someone had been administering small doses over several weeks, possibly months. The symptoms Lady Constance described were entirely consistent with gradual exposure. Yet the final dose was undoubtedly cyanide," Poirot observed. "A sudden change in method that suggests either panic or opportunity. Most interesting. The stage is set." As evening approached, Poirot announced his intention to conduct what he termed a complete reconstruction of events. His manner carried that particular confidence that indicated he had solved the essential mystery, though crucial details remained to be demonstrated. "Tomorrow evening," he declared, "all participants will return to their exact positions of 2 nights ago. we will recreate not merely the physical circumstances, but the psychological atmosphere that led to Lady Constance's death." He moved through the sitting room with meticulous care, adjusting cushions, repositioning books, even replacing the extinguished candle with a fresh one. Every detail was arranged with mathematical precision, as if he were preparing not merely a demonstration, but a scientific experiment. "The mirrors will be our witnesses," he explained, positioning himself once more between the twin giants. "They have reflected every moment of this tragedy, and tomorrow they will reflect the truth that has hidden itself so cleverly between appearance and reality." Standing in that infinite corridor of reflections, with that mysterious shadow wavering in the silvered depths, Poirot made his final preparation. He adjusted a curtain by precisely half an inch, straightened a single cushion, and placed a new candle on the mantel, with the reverence of a priest preparing an altar. "Order," he said with deep satisfaction, his multiple reflections nodding in perfect synchronization. And then, mes amis, the truth will emerge from the shadow between two mirrors, where it has been waiting with infinite patience for Hercule Poirot to discover it. The trap was set, the stage prepared, and somewhere among our suspects, a murderer was beginning to realize that their carefully constructed impossible crime was about to be revealed as an elaborate but ultimately flawed deception. The final act of this deadly drama was ready to begin. The morning brought Poirot's ritualistic calm, his breakfast arranged with mathematical precision that would have driven any ordinary man to distraction. He cut his toast into perfect squares, aligned his cutlery with surveyor's accuracy, and regarded the day ahead with the satisfaction of a conductor preparing for a complex symphony. When I ventured a question about the evening's planned reconstruction, he held up a warning finger and completed his morning ablutions before addressing the matter at hand. "Today, Hastings, we do not reconstruct, we disturb," he announced with quiet satisfaction. "The pot must be stirred before its true flavors can reveal themselves." The chemist's revelation. He dispatched me on what seemed a routine errand, but I had learned to recognize the careful precision behind his seemingly casual requests. Armed with a small list written in his immaculate script, I presented myself at Harbury & Sons, chemists on Bruton Street, where the elder Mr. Harbury received me with old-fashioned courtesy. Upon learning of my connection to the investigation, he produced the poisons register without hesitation. There, under the previous afternoon's entries, was the neat inscription, "Potassium cyanide, quantity small, purchaser, Frederick Pembroke." Yet something about the signature struck me as oddly formal, as if copied rather than written by natural habit. "Do you recall the purchaser personally?" I inquired. "We seek to ensure Mr. Pembroke did not send a messenger." Harbury's weathered face creased in concentration. A person of unusual reserve, I must say. Gloved despite the mild weather, rather peculiar for the season. Paid in exact coin, spoke very little. Not tall, I should say, but slight of build. There was a distinct scent about them, violets, perhaps, quite pronounced. Most memorable was the manner of writing. The EI purchaser used the left hand, which always catches my professional eye. "Left-handed?" I repeated, startled. "But Mr. Pembroke writes with his right hand." "Indeed. Then someone wished to disguise their natural hand." Most curious. The psychological campaign. Returning to Grosvenor Square, I found Poirot had begun what he termed his little games of conscience. With Miss Marsh's discreet assistance, he had arranged private interviews with each suspect, and though I was not present for all, I observed their faces afterward, each bearing the particular pallor that comes from having one's deepest fears given voice. Mrs. Helena Ashworth emerged first, her composure intact but brittle as spun glass. Poirot joined me at the gallery window as she paused beside the west mirror, adjusting a glove with movements that spoke of barely controlled nerves. "I informed Madame that the private investigator from Brighton has completed his report," Poirot murmured. One must observe how the heart receives such information. And has he? I asked. His smile was enigmatic. He has written something. Whether it contains what I suggested to Madame, that is quite another matter. Sir Reginald followed, moving like a man whose bones had learned a new and unwelcome weight. The shipping magnate's usual commanding presence had deteriorated markedly, and when he departed, Poirot observed, "You perceive the difference between fear of scandal and fear of punishment. The first weighs upon the shoulders. The second constricts the throat." Major Fairfax maintained his military bearing, but there was something in his eyes, a combination of guilt, anger, and desperate calculation that suggested a man fighting battles on multiple fronts. His interview had clearly shaken him, though he attempted to conceal it behind professional stoicism. Dr. Thorne arrived without summons, as if drawn by forces beyond his control. His conversation with Poirot was brief but intense, focusing on the medical timeline of Lady Constance's poisoning and the curious acceleration from slow arsenic to sudden cyanide. The technical demonstration. In the afternoon, Poirot conducted an experiment that left me both impressed and deeply unsettled. After dismissing the staff and ensuring our privacy, he produced a length of black silk thread so fine it was nearly invisible against the dark paneling. With tender precision, he affixed this thread along the skirting board, passing it under the sitting-room door on a tiny ramp of wax and anchoring it near the base of the east mirror with a pin that vanished among the ornamental details. "Now, Hastings, position yourself in the exact center of the corridor of reflections," he instructed. "Stand perfectly still and observe what your eyes can and cannot see." From that precise position, something extraordinary occurred. The thread, clearly visible from other angles, simply disappeared into the seam of shadow created by the opposing mirrors. The infinite reflections seemed to swallow the line entirely, creating what appeared to be empty space while concealing a mechanism of deadly precision. Poirot moved his hand a fraction, and somewhere beyond the closed door came a soft click, followed by the faint scrape of something shifting on the sitting-room table. When he opened the door, a small glass had moved precisely 1 inch, and a paperweight had turned as if touched by an invisible hand. "You see," he said, gathering the thread with a conjurer's economy. "A line that is not a line, a touch that requires no presence. To those who watched the door, nothing entered the room. Yet the impossible became merely improbable." I stared in fascination and horror. "Then the poison was delivered by a method that required no physical presence in the room," he confirmed, "but we demonstrate only what might be possible, not what actually occurred. Tonight, we shall ask the truth to reveal itself." The gathering storm. As evening approached, the house settled into that peculiar tension that precedes dramatic revelation. The unseasonable fog that had crept through London streets seemed to wrap around the Grosvenor Square mansion like a shroud, muffling external sounds and creating an atmosphere of otherworldly isolation. Poirot had spent the afternoon in final preparations, adjusting lighting, positioning furniture, and most importantly, ensuring that every detail of the mirror gallery matched exactly the conditions of 2 nights before. His movements carried the reverence of a priest preparing for sacred ritual, combined with the precision of a scientist arranging a crucial experiment. Inspector Japp arrived with visible reluctance, his confidence in Pembroke's guilt somewhat shaken by Poirot's insistence on this reconstruction. "I hope you know what you're about, Poirot," he muttered. "The evidence against that art dealer seems clear enough to me." "Evidence, mon ami, is like these mirrors," Poirot replied, gesturing toward the great silver giants. "It reflects what we place before it, but sometimes what we see is not what actually exists. Tonight, we shall discover whether we have been looking at reality or merely its reflection." The suspects began arriving as darkness fell, their footsteps echoing in the fog-muffled street. Each carried themselves differently than they had 2 nights before. The weight of suspicion and investigation had changed them all. Mrs. Ashworth entered with her head held high, but I detected new brittleness in her manner. Sir Reginald followed heavily, his usual commanding presence further diminished. Major Fairfax came in full dress uniform as if preparing for court-martial, while Dr. Thorne maintained his professional demeanor despite obvious internal turmoil. Miss Marsh had remained at the house throughout the day, her devotion to Lady Constance extending beyond death itself. She moved through the familiar rooms like a guardian spirit, her eyes red-rimmed but determined to see justice done for her beloved mistress. The final preparations. As the last guest arrived, Poirot took his position between the great mirrors, his infinite reflections stretching away into silvered eternity. The mysterious shadow that had puzzled me throughout the investigation appeared once more in the corridor of images, a thin, dark line that seemed to exist independently of any physical object in the room. "Mesdames et messieurs," he announced with quiet gravity, "you have gathered here not merely as witnesses to a reconstruction, but as participants in the final act of a most complex drama. 2 nights ago, in this very gallery, Lady Constance Fairfax was murdered under seemingly impossible circumstances. Tonight, those circumstances will be revealed as merely improbable, the product of careful planning, intimate knowledge, and psychological manipulation of the highest order." He paused, his gaze moving systematically across each face, reading the subtle signs of guilt, fear, and calculation that his afternoon's psychological campaign had brought to the surface. "The murderer stands among us now," he continued with that terrible certainty that had solved so many seemingly impossible cases. "A person who combined technical expertise with intimate knowledge of Lady Constance's habits, who possessed both the means and the desperate motive to silence her before she could reveal secrets that would destroy carefully constructed lives. The trap was set, the stage prepared, and in the space between 2 mirrors, that shadow realm where reflection met reality, the truth waited to emerge with all the inexorable force of justice itself. The final revelation was at hand, and with it the exposure of a murderer who had believed themselves beyond the reach of human detection. Standing in that gallery of infinite reflections, surrounded by the assembled suspects and the watchful presence of the law, Hercule Poirot prepared to demonstrate once again why no crime, however cleverly conceived, could long escape the methodical application of psychology, logic, and those invaluable little gray cells. The fog outside pressed against the tall windows like a living thing, muffling the sounds of London and creating an atmosphere of otherworldly isolation within the mirror gallery. Poirot stood at the precise center of the space between the great mirrors, his small figure commanding absolute attention as he surveyed the assembled suspects with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see past all pretense and deception. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the gallery despite its gentle tone. "We gather here not merely to reconstruct a moment in time, but to witness the revelation of truth itself. I ask that each of you return to your exact positions from 2 nights ago, at the moment when Lady Constance retired to her sitting room for what would prove to be her final rest. The human tableau." With varying degrees of reluctance and visible tension, the suspects arranged themselves according to Poirot's precise directions. Mrs. Helena Ashworth positioned herself near the far mirrors, her elegant bearing maintained despite the obvious strain of the past days. Her gloved hands adjusted her reticule with nervous precision, the violet silk lining catching the gaslight with each movement. Major Fairfax stood at rigid attention near the gallery's far end, his military composure intact, but his eyes betraying the internal struggle of a man wrestling with terrible knowledge. Sir Reginald took his place beside the French mirrors, his usual commanding presence diminished by the weight of suspicion and financial ruin that hung over him like a shroud. Dr. Thorne maintained his professional demeanor near the doorway, though a vein pulsed visibly in his temple as he observed the proceedings with medical detachment warring against personal anxiety. Miss Marsh stationed herself near the sitting-room door, her devoted eyes fixed on the threshold she had watched so faithfully on that fatal evening. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped a handkerchief, her loyalty to Lady Constance extending beyond death itself into this moment of potential justice. "Perfect," Poirot observed with satisfaction. "Now, before we proceed to the mechanics of this most ingenious crime, we must establish certain crucial evidence that has come to light through careful investigation." The handwriting revelation. From his waistcoat pocket, Poirot produced a silver tray bearing several cards and pens. "A small courtesy," he announced with deceptive mildness, "to complete my records. Each of you will kindly note your position and the time upon these cards." The request seemed innocuous enough, but I had learned to recognize the careful precision behind Poirot's seemingly casual experiments. Sir Reginald scrawled with the decisive sweep of a man accustomed to signing orders and contracts. Dr. Thorne's handwriting was small and precise, reflecting his medical training. Major Fairfax wrote with military precision, each letter perfectly formed and centered. Mrs. Ashworth took the pen with elegant grace, her schoolroom-trained right hand producing flowing script across the card. When Poirot requested that she add additional information on a second card, however, I noticed a subtle change. The slightest awkwardness, a barely perceptible hesitation that spoke volumes to the trained observer. Miss Marsh's response proved most revealing. Her hand trembled as she wrote, and when she pushed the card back toward Poirot, there was a distinct leftward smear of ink across the side of her hand. The telltale mark of a naturally left-handed person attempting to write with their right. "Ah," Poirot murmured with gentle satisfaction, "the handwriting that is trained against nature. Most illuminating, mademoiselle. The chemist's register, you recall, Inspector Japp, recorded a left-handed purchaser of potassium cyanide, someone wearing gloves despite the mild weather, someone carrying the distinct scent of violets. The technical demonstration. With theatrical precision that would have done credit to a master magician, Poirot produced from his pocket a length of black silk thread so fine it was nearly invisible against the gallery's dark paneling. Observe, mes amis, how the eye can be deceived by shadows and reflections when truth hides in the spaces we do not think to examine. He moved to the exact center of the corridor created by the opposing mirrors, and immediately that mysterious shadow I had noticed throughout the investigation appeared in the infinite reflections, a thin, dark line that seemed to exist independently of any physical presence in the room. From this precise position, Poirot explained, anchoring one end of the thread near the base of the east mirror, a line becomes invisible to anyone watching from Miss Marsh's station near the door. The eye, focused on the threshold, cannot perceive what exists in the seam of shadow created by perfect reflection. He guided the thread along the skirting board with surgical precision, demonstrating how it passed beneath the sitting-room door on the carefully prepared ramp of wax we had discovered earlier. The mechanism was both simple and ingenious, a means of manipulating objects within the locked room without any physical presence being required. But this thread, while crucial to our mystery, was not the direct instrument of death, Poirot continued, his tone growing more serious. No, mes amis, the actual delivery of poison required a method far more subtle and psychologically devastating. The hidden evidence. Moving to the great mirror that had dominated so much of our investigation, Poirot pressed his finger against what appeared to be a decorative element in the ornate silver frame. With the precision of a master craftsman, he located a tiny mechanism hidden within the elaborate scroll work. A spring-loaded compartment so cleverly concealed that it would escape casual observation entirely. "The rings of Lady Constance," he announced as a small parcel wrapped in violet tissue paper dropped into his waiting palm. Hidden where only someone with intimate knowledge of this mirror's construction could have placed them. The revelation sent a visible shock through the assembled suspects. The rings, Lady Constance's precious sapphire and gold band, lay gleaming in the gaslight, their presence raising more questions than it answered. But why? I asked, voicing the question that hung in everyone's mind. Would the murderer take such care to hide the rings rather than simply dispose of them? Poirot's smile was enigmatic as he carefully rewrapped the jewelry. Because, mon ami, these rings were not merely removed. They were the key to the entire method. Lady Constance never willingly removed them, yet they were found absent from her hands. The question becomes, how does one remove rings from a woman who is dying of cyanide poisoning without entering the room where she lies? The poison delivery method. The technical explanation that followed was both ingenious and chilling in its calculated precision. Poirot demonstrated how a small, specially prepared capsule could be positioned on the door frame of the sitting room, balanced with mathematical accuracy, to fall at the slightest disturbance. The capsule, he explained, contained not liquid poison but a fine crystalline powder of potassium cyanide that would disperse upon impact. The genius of the method, he continued with professional admiration for the criminal mind, lay not in forcing Lady Constance to ingest poison, but in creating circumstances where she would inhale it involuntarily. The powder, dispersing in the air of the closed room, would be breathed naturally, a method that required no cooperation from the victim and left no trace of forced administration. The thread mechanism served a dual purpose. First, to dislodge the poison capsule from its precarious position on the door frame, and second, to remove the evidence of the rings. A thin loop of the same silk thread, positioned carefully around Lady Constance's fingers before the poison took effect, could be drawn tight and pulled back under the door as she succumbed to the cyanide. The rings were removed not as trophies, Poirot explained with grim satisfaction, but because their absence would indicate that something extraordinary had occurred, something that would point investigators toward the impossible rather than the merely improbable. The psychological component. Dr. Thorne stepped forward, his medical training compelling him to address the technical aspects of the crime. The chronic arsenic poisoning we discovered in Lady Constance's system, that was preparatory, wasn't it? Creating symptoms that would make a sudden death seem more plausible. Précisément, Poirot confirmed. Someone had been slowly poisoning Lady Constance for weeks, creating a medical history that would support a natural death. But when she began to suspect the truth, when her investigations threatened to expose not only financial fraud, but attempted murder, desperate measures became necessary. The psychological pressure in the room had become almost tangible. Miss Marsh stood frozen near the doorway, her face pale as the implications of the demonstration became clear. Her position as the devoted companion, the trusted guardian of Lady Constance's well-being, had provided perfect cover for a campaign of slow poisoning that had gone undetected for months. The final irony, Poirot observed with that terrible gentleness he reserved for exposing the deepest human betrayals, is that Lady Constance trusted most completely the person who was killing her. The symptoms of arsenic poisoning, the nausea, the weakness, the episodes of confusion were attributed to natural nervousness, and the very person administering the poison was the one preparing the remedies meant to provide comfort. The mounting evidence. As if summoned by the weight of accumulated proof, Inspector Japp appeared in the doorway with a grim expression and a small evidence bag in his hand. "Found this in Miss Marsh's quarters," he announced quietly. A collection of violet tissue paper cut into precise squares and a small bottle labeled as medication for Lady Constance's nerves. The laboratory analysis shows traces of both arsenic and potassium cyanide. Miss Marsh's composure finally cracked completely. The devoted companion who had served Lady Constance with such apparent loyalty sank into a chair, her hands covering her face as the full weight of exposure settled upon her shoulders. The motive, Poirot continued remorselessly, was as old as human nature itself: greed disguised as devotion. Miss Marsh had been systematically embezzling from Lady Constance's household accounts for years, small amounts that went unnoticed in the management of such a large establishment. But Lady Constance's recent investigations into the authenticity of her collection had led her to examine all her financial records with unprecedented care. The final psychological revelation. The truth, when fully revealed, was both simpler and more complex than any of us had imagined. Miss Marsh, the faithful companion whose devotion had seemed beyond question, had been conducting a carefully orchestrated campaign of murder that combined technical ingenuity with psychological manipulation of the most sophisticated kind. She knew Lady Constance's habits better than anyone, Poirot explained with professional admiration for the criminal mind. She knew about the investigation into the mirrors, about the scheduled meeting with Dr. Thorne, about the growing suspicion that someone in the household was not what they seemed. The slow poisoning with arsenic was meant to culminate in a death that would appear natural, but circumstances forced a change in method. The assembled suspects watched in fascination and horror as the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The locked room mystery that had seemed impossible was revealed as an elaborate stage magic trick, performed by someone with intimate knowledge of the victim's psychology and complete access to her daily routine. Standing once more between the great mirrors, his infinite reflections stretching away into silvered eternity, Poirot delivered his final observation. In the space between two mirrors, mes amis, we find not only the reflection of truth, but truth itself. Miss Marsh created an impossible crime by making us look where she wanted us to look, while the real method remained hidden in the shadows of our own assumptions. The shadow between two mirrors had indeed concealed the truth, but now that truth stood revealed in all its terrible clarity. Justice, like reflection itself, had finally caught up with the one who thought herself beyond its reach. The silence that followed Poirot's methodical demonstration was profound and terrible, broken only by the soft hiss of gaslight and the distant murmur of London traffic muffled by the persistent fog. Miss Marsh remained frozen in her chair, her hands still covering her face, while the assembled suspects absorbed the full implications of what they had witnessed. The devoted companion whose loyalty had seemed beyond question now stood revealed as a murderer of extraordinary cunning and calculated patience. Inspector Japp positioned himself with professional discretion between Miss Marsh and the gallery's exit, his expression combining satisfaction at the case's resolution with genuine disturbance at the psychological complexity of the crime that had been exposed. The locked room mystery that had seemed impossible was now revealed as an elaborate piece of stage magic, performed by someone with intimate knowledge of both the victim's psychology and the physical properties of the crime scene. The psychological unraveling. When Miss Marsh finally lowered her hands, the transformation was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The trembling, devoted companion had vanished entirely, replaced by someone whose calculating intelligence had been masked for decades behind a facade of humble service. Her eyes, no longer red-rimmed with grief, held a cold clarity that made her previous displays of emotion seem like carefully rehearsed theatrical performances. "You cannot possibly understand," she began, her voice carrying a bitter precision that transformed her entirely. The words were directed not to Poirot or the assembled company, but to some invisible tribunal of her own imagination. 40 years of service. 40 years of watching her spend more on a single mirror than I would see in a lifetime of wages. She lived in luxury while I counted pennies. She entertained society while I managed every detail of her comfort. She received credit for charitable works that I organized and executed. The psychological portrait that emerged was both tragic and terrifying. Miss Marsh had constructed an elaborate internal narrative in which she was the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of a carefully planned murder. Her resentment had been building for decades, fed by daily exposure to wealth she could never possess and recognition she felt she deserved but never received. The embezzlement began almost by accident. she continued, her confession flowing with the relief of someone who had carried a terrible secret too long. Small amounts, from the household accounts. Money she would never miss. I told myself it was compensation for services that went far beyond my official duties. But Lady Constance began examining the books with unprecedented attention to detail when her investigation into the mirror's authenticity began. The technical confession. Dr. Thorne, his medical training compelling him to understand the full scope of the crime, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. The chronic arsenic poisoning. How long had that been proceeding? 3 months, Miss Marsh replied with clinical precision that chilled everyone present. Small doses in her evening tisane, amounts that would create symptoms resembling nervous exhaustion. I'd hoped her death would appear natural, the result of her anxious temperament and advancing age. The irony was perfect. She trusted me completely to prepare the very remedies that were slowly killing her. The revelation struck the assembled company with renewed horror. Lady Constance had not merely been betrayed by someone she trusted. She had been systematically poisoned by the person she relied upon for comfort and care during her moments of greatest vulnerability. Poirot's expression remained professionally neutral as he guided Miss Marsh through the technical details of her method. Her explanation revealed a mind capable of extraordinary innovation, combined with intimate psychological knowledge of her victim. The thread mechanism required weeks of preparation, she admitted with something approaching professional pride. I studied the mirror's construction during my daily cleaning routine. The hidden compartment was original to the piece, designed by some long-dead craftsman to conceal small valuables. I merely adapted the spring-loaded mechanism to serve my purposes. The irony was profound and disturbing. Lady Constance's prized possession, one of the crown jewels of her collection, had been transformed into an instrument of her own destruction by someone who understood both its physical properties and its emotional significance. The poison delivery system. The final method was more complex than your demonstration suggested, Miss Marsh continued, her voice taking on the tone of a craftsman explaining a particularly challenging project. The capsule had to be positioned with mathematical precision to fall at exactly the right moment, and the cyanide powder had to be prepared in the correct consistency to disperse properly upon impact. I spent hours calculating the air currents in that room, the way the powder would spread, the time it would take to achieve lethal concentration. Inspector Japp interrupted with a practical question that reflected his years of criminal investigation. And the purchase at the chemist's shop? You disguised your handwriting and wore gloves to conceal your identity? I studied Mr. Pembroke's signature from Lady Constance's correspondence, Miss Marsh replied matter-of-factly. The left-handed writing was meant to confuse the evidence, though I see now that it merely created another clue for Monsieur Poirot to follow. The violet scent was from my own toilette water. I had not considered that such a personal detail might betray me. The moment of truth. Mrs. Helena Ashworth, who had maintained her composure throughout the evening's revelations, now spoke with a voice that trembled slightly despite her obvious efforts at control. But the rings, why remove them at all? Why create such an impossible detail? Miss Marsh's smile was bitter as winter frost. Because impossibility creates confusion, and confusion creates doubt. If Lady Constance had simply been found dead with no signs of struggle, questions might have been asked about her recent symptoms, about who had access to her food and drink. But an impossible crime, a locked room mystery with no apparent solution, that would send investigators chasing shadows while the real murderer remained hidden in plain sight. The psychological sophistication of the crime was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. Miss Marsh had not merely killed her employer. She had attempted to transform the murder into an intellectual puzzle that would obscure the simple truth of betrayed trust and systematic exploitation. The final psychological analysis. Poirot listened to this confession with that particular attention he paid to the deepest mysteries of human nature. His questions were gentle but penetrating, designed to illuminate not only the mechanics of the crime, but the psychological journey that had led a devoted companion to become a calculating murderer. "You had convinced yourself that the embezzlement was justified," he observed with clinical precision. "But when did you first consider murder as a solution to your difficulties?" Miss Marsh's answer revealed the gradual corruption of a mind that had rationalized increasingly serious crimes as necessary responses to circumstances beyond her control. "When I realized that exposure would mean not only disgrace, but imprisonment. I'd given my life to Lady Constance's service. I could not accept that it would end in scandal and ruin. The slow poisoning seemed merciful, even kind. She would simply grow weaker and pass away peacefully, sparing both of us the trauma of exposure and confrontation." The assembled suspects listened to this justification with varying degrees of horror and fascination. Sir Reginald, despite his own financial troubles, seemed genuinely appalled by the betrayal of domestic loyalty that the crime represented. Major Fairfax maintained his military composure, though his eyes reflected the particular horror of a soldier confronted with an enemy who had fought without honor. The moral reckoning. Dr. Thorne's expression reflected the professional horror of a physician confronted with the systematic betrayal of medical trust. "You used your position as her caregiver to administer poison while pretending to provide comfort. The violation of trust is almost beyond comprehension." "Trust," Miss Marsh repeated, her voice carrying decades of accumulated bitterness. "She trusted me to manage her household while she lived in luxury. She trusted me to sacrifice my own prospects for her convenience. She trusted me to remain grateful for wages that barely covered my basic needs, while she spent fortunes on mirrors and curiosities. That trust was not mutual. It was exploitation disguised as benevolence." The fog outside had begun to lift, allowing pale moonlight to filter through the tall windows and create new patterns of light and shadow across the mirror gallery. The great mirrors that had been silent witnesses to Lady Constance's murder now reflected a scene of justice finally achieved, though at a cost that would resonate through all the lives touched by this tragedy. Poirot's final observation. Standing once more between the twin mirrors, his infinite reflections stretching away into silvered eternity, Poirot delivered his final observation on the case that had revealed the shadow between appearance and reality. "In these mirrors, mes amis, we see not only our reflections, but the reflections of our choices, our secrets, and our true natures." Miss Marsh believed she could hide her crime in the space between two mirrors, in that shadow realm where appearance and reality intersect. But truth, like light itself, finds a way to illuminate even the darkest corners of the human heart. He paused, his gaze encompassing the assembled company with that mixture of sadness and satisfaction that marked the conclusion of his most challenging cases. The locked room was never locked, you see. It was watched, but by someone whose very presence we had been trained not to question. The impossible crime was merely improbable, hidden behind our assumptions about loyalty, devotion, and the nature of service itself. As Inspector Japp moved forward to formally arrest Miss Marsh, she rose from her chair with a dignity that seemed oddly out of place given the circumstances. The transformation was complete. The devoted companion had vanished forever, replaced by someone whose true nature had finally been revealed in all its calculated complexity. The murderer had been exposed, the method revealed, and justice would soon be served. Yet the psychological complexity of the crime would linger long after the legal proceedings concluded, a reminder that the most dangerous criminals are often those we trust most completely, and that the greatest betrayals occur not between strangers, but between those bound by years of intimacy and shared experience. In the space between two mirrors, where reflection met reality, the truth had finally emerged from the shadows where it had hidden with infinite patience, waiting for Hercule Poirot's little gray cells to discover it. The click of handcuffs in that gallery of infinite reflections carried a finality that seemed to echo through the silvered depths of the great mirrors themselves. Miss Marsh rose with a dignity that struck me as both admirable and deeply unsettling, the composure of someone who had prepared for this moment, even as she had hoped to avoid it. Inspector Japp's voice, steady and professional, cut through the charged atmosphere as he recited the formal charges. Sarah Marsh, I am arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Lady Constance Fairfax, and on charges of administering poison with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence. She inclined her head with the same courtesy she had shown to visitors throughout her decades of service. There is very little left to say, Inspector. The truth has finally found its way to the surface. The immediate aftermath. Poirot watched not the arrest itself, but the mirrors that had been silent witnesses to this elaborate deception. With characteristic precision, he adjusted his position by exactly 1 inch, and the mysterious shadow that had haunted the corridor of reflections collapsed like a fan snapping shut. The physical evidence of the crime, that impossibly fine thread, had been removed, but its absence was as revealing as its presence had been. With the line removed, he murmured to me, the shadow confesses too. The machinery of justice moved with practiced efficiency. Japp dispatched constables to secure additional evidence from Miss Marsh's quarters, where they discovered her sewing basket containing the damning proof, reels of ordinary cotton, packets of needles, and nestled beneath a packet of mending silk, a small wooden bobbin wound with black gossamer thread so fine one had to angle it toward the light to perceive it at all. The outer rim bore traces of the same wax we had found on the sitting-room skirting board. Like a spider spinning death, Japp muttered with professional disgust as he catalogued the evidence. Character reckonings. The revelation of Miss Marsh's guilt created a cascade of consequences that would reshape the lives of everyone connected to Lady Constance's household. Mr. Pembroke, summoned hastily from the police station where he had spent a sleepless night in custody, arrived pale and rumpled, but visibly transformed by relief. When Japp returned the pristine vial of potassium cyanide with a brusque apology, the art dealer's composure cracked entirely. He wept openly, a display that embarrassed me, but which Poirot received with gentle understanding. I shall answer for my part in the forgeries, Pembroke said when he had composed himself. The misattributions, the false provenances, I will face the consequences, but murder, never. I could never have taken a life. Courage, monsieur, Poirot replied, with characteristic compassion. You were foolish, perhaps venal, but you were not cruel. There is a distinction that matters greatly in the scales of justice. Major Fairfax's reckoning came with the blunt clarity of a soldier's confession. Standing at rigid attention as if on parade, he admitted his role in the reproduction scheme with unflinching honesty. I thought I could make them perfect, he said, his voice carrying the weight of profound disillusionment. I told myself I was restoring beauty to the world, using skills learned in service to the Empire, but it was theft by another name, and I will answer for it. The psychological complexity of his situation was evident to all present. His military service had earned him respect but little financial security, and his aunt's wealth had seemed both tantalizingly close and impossibly distant. The forgery scheme had offered a way to bridge that gap using his legitimate skills in restoration and craftsmanship. Medical and social implications. Dr. Thorne's professional perspective provided crucial context for understanding the full scope of Miss Marsh's crime. The chronic arsenic poisoning would have created a gradual decline in Lady Constance's mental acuity and physical strength, he explained with clinical precision. She may have been less able to detect financial irregularities or to defend herself against psychological manipulation than she would have been in full health. This observation added another dimension of horror to the crime. Miss Marsh had not merely betrayed someone who trusted her completely. She had systematically weakened her victim's ability to recognize and respond to that betrayal. The slow poisoning had served multiple purposes, creating symptoms that would make sudden death seem plausible, gradually undermining Lady Constance's investigative capabilities and providing the murderer with a sense of power and control. The social implications extended far beyond the immediate household. Sir Reginald, his earlier fears about his wife's past now seeming almost trivial, faced the daunting task of unraveling years of financial deception. The embezzlement may have been proceeding for decades, he said heavily. The lawyers and accountants will require months to determine the full extent of the damage to the estate. Mrs. Helena Ashworth, cleared of suspicion but sobered by the domestic horror that had been revealed, voiced the question that troubled everyone present. How could we have been so completely deceived? She seemed the very model of devoted service. Poirot's psychological analysis. Ah, madame, Poirot replied with that gentle sadness that marked his observations about human nature's darker aspects. But that was precisely the source of her strength as a criminal. Who suspects the faithful companion, who questions the devoted servant who sacrifices her own comfort for her employer's well-being? Miss Marsh constructed the perfect disguise by becoming indispensable. His analysis revealed the gradual corruption of a mind that had rationalized increasingly serious crimes as necessary responses to circumstances largely of its own creation. She represents a particular type of criminal, the individual who commits murder not from passion or sudden desperation, but from a gradual corruption of moral judgment combined with exceptional opportunity. Each transgression was justified by the previous one, each escalation made necessary by the fear of exposure. The psychological sophistication of the crime was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. Miss Marsh had not merely exploited Lady Constance's trust. She had systematically corrupted the very relationship that should have provided comfort and security in the victim's final years. Technical resolution. As the evening progressed and the immediate shock of revelation began to settle, Poirot conducted his final examination of the physical evidence with characteristic thoroughness. The thread mechanism, the hidden compartment in the mirror, and the poison delivery system were documented with scientific precision for the legal proceedings that would follow. The ingenuity of the method was remarkable, he observed to Inspector Japp as they examined the spring-loaded mechanism concealed within the mirror's ornate frame. Miss Marsh possessed not only intimate knowledge of Lady Constance's habits and psychology, but genuine technical skill in adapting the mirror's original design to serve her murderous purposes. The irony was profound and disturbing. Lady Constance's passion for collecting mirrors, objects that revealed truth and reflected hidden details, had been turned against her by someone who understood both their physical properties and their emotional significance. The moral reckoning. As the formal investigation concluded and the suspects began to disperse into the fog-shrouded London night, Poirot shared his final observations about the case that had revealed so much about the capacity for deception hidden within seemingly ordinary relationships. The locked room mystery was never about locked doors or impossible circumstances, he said, adjusting his overcoat with characteristic precision. It was about locked minds, our inability to see past the roles people play to the reality of who they truly are. Miss Marsh murdered Lady Constance not in spite of their close relationship, but because of it. The intimacy that should have provided protection became the very weapon used to destroy it. Standing once more between the twin mirrors that had played such a crucial role in the case, Poirot made his final philosophical observation. His infinite reflections stretched away into silvered eternity, but the mysterious shadow that had concealed the murder weapon was gone, banished by the light of truth and justice. In these mirrors, Hastings, he said with quiet satisfaction, we have seen not only the reflection of crime, but the reflection of human nature itself. Miss Marsh believed she could hide her true self behind a facade of devoted service, but mirrors, like truth, reveal what we attempt to conceal. Departure and reflection. The fog had begun to lift as we stepped into Grosvenor Square, revealing the familiar outlines of London's streets and the reassuring presence of gaslight pushing back the darkness. Behind us, the great house stood silent, its windows reflecting nothing now but empty rooms and the memory of a crime that had challenged everything we thought we understood about trust, loyalty, and the hidden capacity for evil that can lurk behind the most familiar faces. "There is nothing more to see here," Poirot announced with finality as we reached the foot of the front steps. "Nothing?" I glanced back toward the gallery, where the two great mirrors now reflected only each other, endless and empty. "Rien du tout," he confirmed with that satisfaction that came from order restored and justice served. "The shadow is gone, mon ami. Truth has emerged from the space between reflection and reality, and with it, the exposure of a murderer who believed herself beyond the reach of human detection." As our cab pulled away into the London night, I reflected on the case that had revealed the shadow between two mirrors to be not a supernatural phenomenon, but the carefully constructed hiding place of a human heart, corrupted by decades of resentment and betrayal. Justice had been served, but the psychological complexity of what we had discovered would resonate long after the legal proceedings concluded, a reminder that the most dangerous criminals are often those we trust most completely. The affair at the shadow between two mirrors was closed, but its lessons about the nature of trust, betrayal, and the masks we wear would endure in the memory long after the mirrors themselves had been packed away and sold. Their reflections no longer needed to reveal the truth that had hidden so patiently in their silvered depths. The weeks following Miss Marsh's arrest moved with that measured pace that attends the machinery of British justice when confronted with a case whose evidence admits no reasonable doubt. The preliminary hearing was conducted with appropriate gravity, Inspector Japp presenting the physical evidence, the specialized thread, the forged signature at the chemist's, the traces of poison found in Miss Marsh's quarters, with the methodical precision that had characterized the entire investigation. The legal resolution. Miss Marsh maintained her dignified composure throughout the proceedings, answering questions with the same courtesy she had once shown to Lady Constance's guests. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed a mind of exceptional intelligence that had gradually corrupted itself through decades of accumulated resentment, yet showed no signs of diminished capacity or mental illness. "She represents," Dr. Aldrich Pemberton reported to the court, "the most dangerous type of criminal, one who commits methodical evil while maintaining the perfect facade of virtue. Her crime was not born of passion or sudden desperation, but of a calculated corruption of moral judgment combined with extraordinary opportunity." The trial itself was mercifully brief. Miss Marsh's detailed confession, combined with Poirot's demonstration of the murder method, left little room for defense. Her counsel could only plead for mercy based on her decades of faithful service before the fatal corruption of her character. The jury, asked to choose between an unhappy woman and a calculating poisoner, found the latter beyond reasonable doubt. When sentence was pronounced, death by hanging, Miss Marsh received it with the same composure she'd maintained throughout, inclining her head as if acknowledging a dinner invitation rather than a death warrant. Individual reckonings. The resolution of the case brought varied fates to those whose lives had been touched by Lady Constance's murder. Mr. Pembroke, cleared of the darkest suspicion yet stained by his role in the forgery scheme, made complete restitution and accepted a term of imprisonment with something approaching relief. "Better honest walls than mirrored ones," Poirot observed when we learned of his sentence. Major Fairfax faced his court-martial with the same military bearing that had carried him through the Indian campaigns, accepting his disgrace without plea or excuse. His expertise in restoration work earned him consideration for supervised employment in a museum workshop after serving his sentence, a penance that seemed both exact and fitting. Sir Reginald and Mrs. Helena Ashworth confronted the complex task of rebuilding their lives and finances in the wake of Miss Marsh's systematic embezzlement. The investigation revealed that the theft had been proceeding for nearly a decade, small amounts that had gone unnoticed in the management of such a large household. Yet there was something almost liberating in finally having the truth exposed, however painful its implications. Dr. Thorne's sanatorium project, deprived of Lady Constance's promised funding, found another benefactor, perhaps moved to generosity by the tragic circumstances. The doctor also wrote a medical paper on the misdiagnosis of chronic arsenic exposure, sending a quiet copy to Poirot with a note expressing gratitude that said more than its measured sentences. The fate of the collection. Lady Constance's magnificent collection of mirrors faced the harsh scrutiny of experts summoned by a world that grows exacting only after it has been deceived. Some pieces were authenticated, others demoted, and the Marlborough pair, despite their beauty, were condemned to the status of clever 19th-century reproductions. The irony was profound. The very mechanism that had concealed Lady Constance's rings proved the mirrors' later origin beyond dispute. They were purchased by the Victoria and Albert Museum, where a placard now explains not only their artistry, but the seductions and perils of provenance. An honest afterlife for a dishonest youth, I remarked to Poirot when we read the catalogue entry together. Exactement, he replied with satisfaction, and a corrective to the human tendency to believe what flatters the eye. The great house in Grosvenor Square was sold to a shipping merchant who cared nothing for its tragic history, only its convenient location and impressive proportions. The Mirror Gallery, once the scene of elegant soirees and civilized conversation, stood empty, its reflections now showing only vacant rooms and the ghosts of departed grandeur. Poirot's final reflections. On a grey afternoon, some weeks after Miss Marsh's execution, carried out with characteristic British efficiency on a cold February morning, I found Poirot in his sitting room, adjusting the angle of a modest mirror above the mantel by the smallest degree imaginable. "There," he said, stepping back with satisfaction. "Now the symmetry, it is perfect." I made the obvious observation about a man who had straightened the soul of a crime being incapable of leaving a picture frame askew, and he received it with the indulgence of a tutor tolerating a pupil's wit. "You have observed, Hastings," he said, settling into his favorite chair, "that in this affair the evidence which impressed the eye, the locked door, the infinite reflections, was not false, but incomplete. It is the same with persons. We see the role, a companion, a nephew, a physician, and we say, 'I know this.' But always there is the interval between appearances, the little space where a man or woman places what is inconvenient to show. And it was the interval between two mirrors, I ventured, that allowed Miss Marsh to hide her deadly thread. Précisément. You grasp it at last. The mirrors told the truth perfectly, but the eye did not know how to read it. One must learn to stand in the exact place. That is all detection is in the end, choosing the right position from which to regard the facts and the people." He poured chocolate, the best in London naturally, and in that comfortable room the horrors of cyanide and arsenic seemed very far away. Yet they were not forgotten. I asked, perhaps unwisely, whether he felt pity for Miss Marsh. He was silent for a long moment, his fingers adjusting the precise arrangement of his morning newspapers. "It is not the pity which excuses," he said at last, "but the pity which understands the beginning. She began with the small theft that seems to all the world not theft at all, a coin, a minute, an omission. Then, as always when one chooses disorder, greater disorder is required to hide the lesser, to restore the order. That is the task of Hercule Poirot. But order without kindness would be tyranny, and kindness without order is folly. Between them a balance, like the two mirrors, n'est-ce pas? The final walk. "Come, Hastings," Poirot said at last, setting down his cup with precise finality. "We will walk. The air, it is beneficial to the little grey cells after they have laboured so intensively." Outside, London went about its business, untroubled by metaphysics or the recent exposure of domestic evil. We strolled past shop windows where mirrors multiplied merchandise into abundance, past a jeweller's where a single sapphire ring gleamed with honest light. I caught my reflection beside Poirot's and was struck by the odd comfort of it. Two figures proceeding in step, affected by shadows, yet not deceived by them. "The affair at the shadow between two mirrors," Poirot announced, as if pronouncing a title upon a book he had already arranged in perfect order on his shelves. "It is closed. The truth has emerged from the space where reflection meets reality, and justice has been served." We paused before a modest looking-glass in a pawnbroker's doorway, and Poirot adjusted it by the smallest touch, smiling at the corrected reflection. "One must not permit shadows to collect, mon ami," he observed, with that characteristic blend of practicality and philosophy. "Even the little ones. For in the end, it is not the grand deceptions that destroy us, but the small compromises we make with truth, the tiny shadows we allow to gather in the corners of our conscience." As we turned toward home, the fog began to lift, revealing the familiar outlines of London's streets and the reassuring presence of gaslight pushing back the darkness. Behind us, somewhere in the great city, the mirrors that had witnessed Lady Constance's final moments were finding new homes, their reflections destined to illuminate different lives and different truths. The shadow between two mirrors had been dispelled at last, but its lesson remained, that the greatest mysteries lie not in locked rooms or impossible crimes, but in the human heart itself, with its infinite capacity for both devotion and betrayal, and that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are those who know us best and whom we trust most completely. In solving the case, Hercule Poirot had done more than expose a murderer. He had revealed the profound truth that justice, like reflection itself, requires the proper angle of observation to be clearly seen. And in that clarity, order was restored to a world briefly shaken by the revelation that evil can wear the most familiar and trusted face of all. Spring returned to London with that particular diffidence the city favors. A tentative warmth in the air, a softening of harsh winter shadows, and the gradual emergence of life from the grey cocoon of February's bleakness. It had been 3 months since Miss Marsh's execution, carried out with characteristic British efficiency on a cold morning that seemed to drain all colour from the world. The newspapers had moved on to fresh scandals with their customary alacrity, but for those who had witnessed the methodical unravelling of her carefully constructed deception, the memory lingered with uncomfortable persistence. The Mirror's new home. "Come, Hastings," Poirot announced one afternoon, adjusting his hat with mathematical precision. "We will visit the Victoria and Albert Museum. The past, it submits more willingly to order than the present, and today I feel the need for such reassurance." We found the Marlborough mirrors displayed not in confrontation as they had been in Lady Constance's gallery, but at a judicious angle across a long, well-lit corridor. A discreet glass barrier prevented enthusiastic visitors from approaching too closely, and the accompanying placard, written in that neutral tone museums prefer, explained their provenance and subsequent reattribution with scholarly detachment. The romantic fiction of their royal heritage had been replaced by the more modest truth of 19th-century craftsmanship, yet their beauty remained undiminished. A young curator approached, recognizing Poirot with the barely concealed excitement of someone meeting a legend. "The mechanism in the frame," he explained eagerly, "the hidden compartment that proved their later manufacture. It's become quite the attraction. Visitors seem to enjoy the idea of a secret, whatever its date." Poirot smiled with gentle irony. "It is the confession without the shame, monsieur. A mystery solved becomes merely charming rather than dangerous." At his polite request, The curator had the mirrors adjusted by the smallest degree, and immediately there sprang between them a faint echo of their former enchantment, a diminished corridor of reflections that stretched away into silvered infinity. A small girl, clinging to her governess's hand, gazed into the altered space and laughed with delight. "It goes on forever," she announced to the world. "Only until you know where to stand," Poirot replied gravely, and the governess, not understanding but somehow comforted, smiled her thanks. The survivors' reckonings. The resolution of the case had brought varied fates to those whose lives had been touched by Lady Constance's murder. Mr. Pembroke, released after serving his sentence for fraud, had retreated to a cottage in Cornwall where he dedicated himself to the honest restoration of genuinely antique furniture. His letters to Poirot, accompanied by meticulous sketches of his work, spoke of a man seeking redemption through absolute integrity in his craft. Major Fairfax had emerged from his court-martial and imprisonment as a changed man, his military swagger replaced by quiet humility. His expertise in traditional craftsmanship found legitimate expression in a provincial museum, where his insistence on absolute authenticity in restoration work suggested a profound internal reckoning with his past deceptions. Sir Reginald and Mrs. Helena Ashworth had weathered the financial storms caused by Miss Marsh's systematic embezzlement, their marriage emerging stronger for having survived such a test together. They had quietly established a small foundation providing authentication services for elderly collectors, a practical memorial to Lady Constance that served the dual purpose of preventing fraud while honoring her memory. Dr. Thorne had channeled his distress over his unwitting role in the tragedy into advocacy for greater diagnostic vigilance regarding chronic poisoning symptoms. His sanatorium project, eventually funded through discreet channels, had become a leading institution emphasizing both physical and mental well-being. The complexity of justice. As we walked through the museum's quiet galleries, Poirot reflected on the case's deeper implications with that philosophical precision that marked his most profound observations. Justice has been served, mon ami, but observe how it cuts with a double edge. Miss Marsh paid the ultimate price for her crimes, yet Lady Constance's memory remains forever tainted by the knowledge of how completely she was betrayed. He paused before a display of Georgian silver, his reflection multiplied in its polished surfaces. To be murdered by one's enemy is a tragedy of circumstance. To be murdered by one's trusted companion, that is a violation of the very foundations upon which civilized society rests. The physical crime was solved in a matter of days, but the psychological wound it inflicted will never fully heal. The observation struck me as particularly astute. We had witnessed not merely a murder, but the systematic corruption of everything that should have been noble in human relationships. Loyalty, devotion, the sacred trust between those who serve and those who are served. The broader implications. The case had raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of domestic service and the psychological pressures inherent in relationships of such intimate inequality. Social reformers had seized upon Miss Marsh's story as evidence of systemic problems, while others argued that her crime was an aberration that should not be used to cast suspicion on the thousands of honest servants throughout Britain. The tragedy, Poirot observed, as we examined a collection of household objects from various periods, is not that Miss Marsh was born evil, but that she made a series of small compromises with honesty, each seemingly justified by circumstances, until she found herself capable of acts she would once have found unthinkable. The first theft was an error of judgment, the last was a calculated choice. Between them lay a road paved with increasingly elaborate justifications. His analysis penetrated to the heart of human psychology. Miss Marsh had not simply exploited Lady Constance's trust. She had systematically corrupted the very relationship that should have provided comfort and security in her employer's final years. The mirror's final lesson. Returning to the Marlborough mirrors for one last look, Poirot positioned himself at the exact center of their reflected corridor. For just a moment, I could see the faint outline of what might have been a shadow in the silvered depths. Not a real threat now, but a reminder of how easily the eye can be deceived when it expects to see only what it has been trained to observe. "These mirrors taught us," he said with quiet satisfaction, "that truth emerges not from what we wish to see, but from learning to stand in the exact place where reality can be clearly observed." Miss Marsh's great error was believing she could control the angle from which others viewed her actions. But justice, like reflection itself, requires only the proper perspective to be clearly seen. A curator approached to announce the museum's closing time, and we took our leave of the mirrors that had played such a crucial role in our investigation. As we walked through London's evening streets, the lights of the city reflecting off countless windows and shop fronts, I found myself contemplating the case's enduring lessons. The philosophical resolution. "The affair at the shadow between two mirrors," Poirot announced with the finality of a book being closed, "has taught us something fundamental about the nature of truth itself. In a world where appearances can deceive and trusted relationships can mask the deepest betrayals, the detective's task is not merely to solve crimes, but to restore faith in the possibility that reality can be distinguished from its reflections." He paused at a jeweler's window where a small mirror had been knocked slightly askew by the day's customers. With characteristic precision, he touched the glass with his gloved finger and corrected the deviation by no more than a breath. "The world cannot be set entirely straight, mon ami," he said, his eyes brightening with that small triumph only he could properly appreciate. "But by degrees, we improve the angle. Sometimes that is enough to banish the shadows that gather in the corners of the human heart." As we turned toward home, the fog began to lift, revealing the familiar outlines of London's streets bathed in the gentle light of gas lamps and early electric bulbs. Behind us, in the museum's quiet halls, the mirrors continued their eternal duty of reflection, showing truth to all who had the wisdom to stand in the proper place to see it clearly. The shadow between two mirrors had been dispelled at last, but its lesson remained, that the greatest mysteries lie not in locked rooms or impossible crimes, but in the human heart itself, with its infinite capacity for both devotion and betrayal. In solving the case, Hercule Poirot had done more than expose a murderer. He had demonstrated that justice, like truth itself, requires only the proper angle of observation to emerge from even the most carefully constructed deceptions. The case was closed, but its wisdom would endure, a reminder that order and truth, however fragile, can always triumph over the shadows of deception when illuminated by the methodical application of logic, psychology, and those invaluable little gray cells.